Thank you for tuning into Hidden Sovereign Truth Revealed. Chronology, the calendar, and the Kametic Great Year. No proper investigation of Afro-Kametic thought, arising out of what Gerald Massey calls a natural genesis in Inner Africa, evolving into its mature form in ancient Egypt, and remanifesting itself in Judaism and Christianity, can proceed without a careful consideration of Kametic, Egyptian chronology, and the world's great year. To us moderns, history has nothing to do with stars and planets. The mechanistic view of the universe ushered in by Isaac Newton leaves no room for astral influences, and even to suggest such a thing is to invite the anathema of pseudoscience from learned circles. The case was very different in antiquity among learned men of that time, including those vaunted rationalists, the Greeks. The relationship between Earth and the Empyrean was so palpably self-evident as to require no demonstration. However much we may insist that heavenly bodies and their movements do not affect human affairs, we cannot possibly understand the psychic and cultural worlds of the ancients unless we deign to consider this vital nexus between humanity and the heavens they took for granted. Even Otto Neugebauer, who affected a studied contempt for the scientific achievements of the ancient Egyptians, was compelled to admit that there never was a more perfect calendar than the one they devised. Our time reckoning is tied to a more or less arbitrary moment in history. That of the ancient Egyptians was guided entirely by natural and cosmic cycles, providing the nearest thing we have to an absolute calendar, valid for all times and places on Earth. Our calendar, with minor modifications the one the Egyptians devised, is such a commonplace that we have no inkling of the amazing intellectual labor that produced it. The creation of any serviceable calendar requires such detailed knowledge of astronomical movements that it presupposes a long prior period of precise observation and meticulous recording of the results. Plato insisted that the Egyptians had been charting the stars and planets for at least 10,000 years, and he does not seem to have been exaggerating. Egypt, being a dry country, lay under clear nighttime skies for months on end, ideal for naked eye observations of the heavenly bodies. Consequently, they had devised 3 calendars: stellar, lunar, and solar. The Venusian calendar of the Iatter Dogon makes us wonder if perhaps the Egyptians possessed this one as well. They knew of the lunar year of 354 days, which still determines the Muslim calendar, but at a time long anterior to the dynastic period, they had discovered the solar year of 360 days plus 5 intercalated or epigomenal days. Many think they had originally measured the year mistakenly at 360 days, and then added 5 more when they realized their error. It is hard to justify such a view. Once they had discovered the solar year, they measured it at 365 days from the very first. But being an eminently practical people, they used 360 days for the conventional year, because it provided convenient whole number multiples by which to subdivide the year 12 30-day months, 10 36-day decans, 36 10-day weeks, etc. It is no coincidence that the 360 days of the conventional solar year is the same as the number of degrees in a geometric circle. Egyptian astronomers knew that the world was spherical and described an elliptical path around the sun. There probably have never been more exacting astrometricians than the ancient Kamets, and in some domains of physical science, their precision has not been excelled even by modern instrumentation. The measurement of the solar year at 365 days was close but not exact. However, 2 more precise measurements for the year were derived: the solar year, measured from solstice to solstice, of 365.24219 days, and the Sothic or sidereal year of 365.25636 days. This latter measurement for the year was obtained from a startling celestial event known as the heliacal rising of Sirius. called Sothis among the Greeks and Septet among the Egyptians. For most of the year, at the latitude of Thebes in Upper Egypt, Sirius, a star in the southern heaven, is invisible, but it appears suddenly on the eastern horizon just before dawn at the summer solstice. This is known as its heliacal rising. Within 20 days after this solstitial rising, the Nile flood begins. The coincidence of all these events left a profound impression on the minds of the early Kametic astronomers, who made Sirius the herald of the sun, the announcer of the flood, and the harbinger of the new year. The ancient Kametes rounded off the length of the tropical year to 365.14 years, an almost exact mean between solstitial and Sothic year. This discrepancy meant that the civil calendar used by the Egyptians retrograded from the true year by 1 day per year, reconverging with the true or sidereal year, determined by the heliacal rising of Sirius, 1,460 years. This is known as the Sothic cycle, and its discovery was an amazing feat of astronomical observation, allowing the Egyptians to regulate their calendars according to objective and measurable celestial movements. But the true significance of the Sothis calendar lies in its role in reconstructing Egyptian dynastic chronology, because certain regnal years of several reigns through the course of Egyptian history were recorded by reference to the Sothic cycle. A famous inscription by Censorinus tells us that the Egyptian New Year and the heliacal rising of Sirius coincided in 139 AD, which means they did in 1321 BCE, 2781 BCE, and 4241 BCE as well. There are two inscriptions in the records of the 18th dynasty that refer to the regnal years of the reigning pharaoh and their positions in the Sothic cycle, allowing us, by knowing the lengths of all the reigns of the 18th dynasty pharaohs, to fix an almost certain date of 1580 BCE for the beginning of the 18th dynasty. Earlier than that, however, the view of chronology becomes decidedly clouded, though we have the names and regnal links of most pharaohs, with the possible exception of Senusert III. It is difficult to relate these reigns to any fixed point in time. The single most important documentary evidence we have bearing on Egyptian chronology is preserved extracts from the mostly lost history of Manetho, an Egyptian priest commissioned by Ptolemy Philadelphus to write a complete history of Egypt. Manetho, though he wrote in Greek, had access to all the historical archives of Egypt and was the first to arrange the sequence of pharaonic reigns into dynasties, a scheme that has proved so useful to historiography that it remains in force today. According to Manetho, there were 30 dynasties representing 330 kings. Modern Egyptology, though completely dependent on Manetho's framework, has had difficulty accepting it unmodified, for it would push the beginning of Egyptian dynastic history back to 5500 BCE. So much of Manetho's history is lost that long sequences of reigns cannot be connected to established temporal reference points. Consequently, modern Egyptology has subjected Manetho to deep revision. Several Egyptian records, the Turin Papyrus, the Abydos Papyrus, and the Palermo Stone, represent authentic Egyptian king lists, and though they seem to corroborate Manetho in many particulars, discrepancies in the lengths of certain dynasties and individual reigns are apparent. Following the lead of Meyer and Breasted in the early part of this century, specialists have sought to reconcile the chronology of Manetho with a presumed date of 3400-3100 BCE for the beginning of Egyptian dynastic history. They have focused most of their attention on the first and second intermediate periods in Manetho's system, which represent more or less prolonged periods of political and social upheaval punctuated by many ephemeral reigns. Chronologists have sought to conflate the reigns in these two periods by presuming that many kings actually ruled simultaneously over different parts of the country. The effect of this compressed the time span of Egyptians' dynastic chronology by more than 2,000 years. Meyer postulated a first dynasty date of 3400 BCE, which Breasted adopted, but since his time this date has inched downward, so that chronologists now routinely speak of the beginning of the first dynasty at 3000 BCE. This dating has encouraged the supposition that Egyptian civilization erupted almost overnight. The well-documented pre-dynastic Egyptian culture and the recently discovered pre-Egyptian Nubian pharaonic civilization at Taseti seem not to have influenced this perception at all. John G. Jackson, in private conversation, once offered the opinion that the real reason behind this strenuous downdating was to allow antiquarian to place the beginning of Egyptian civilization after that of Sumer, whose earliest archaeological remains are said to date from 4000 BCE, about 1,000 years earlier than the received date for the first Egyptian dynasty. It is here, however, that the Egyptian calendar creates a problem. The Sothic cycle compels us to conclude that the earliest calendar date in Egypt is no later than 4241 BCE. Such a calendar, due to the high level of astronomical sophistication required to create it, means that civilization flourished in Egypt at least 6,200 years ago, before there ever was a Sumer. The reasons for wanting to give Sumer pride of place are not hard to determine. Sumer is outside of Africa, and if it can be proved to be the world's first high culture, then one need not admit that civilization was born in Africa. Egyptologists have tried to maneuver around this Sothic date of 4241 BCE for the beginning of the calendar by suggesting instead that it was not invented until the later Sothic date of 2781 BCE. Whatever chronology is used, this 2781 BCE date comes after the beginning of the first dynasty. The pre-dynastic specialist Michael Hoffman has argued that once the Sothic cycle was discovered, the Egyptians could start their calendar arbitrarily at any date by calculation. So we need not assume that the first calendar date in history is 4241 BCE. This seems to be Hoffman's way of circumventing the incongruity that Egyptian civilization had already been in full bloom for 400 years, short chronology, before inventing the calendar. It is equally incongruous to suppose that the Egyptians would have installed any time reckoning system by interpolation, inasmuch as these celestial cycles were sacred, the very movements of the gods themselves. An ivory tablet from the first dynasty that describes the coincidence of the heliacal rising of Sirius, the annual Nile flood, and the new year showing beyond all contradiction that the ancient Egyptians knew of the Sothic cycle and its relationship to the flood and civil calendar well before 2781 BCE. Thus, they would had to have known of the cycle beginning at least at 4241 BCE, and it is therefore absurd to think they would have introduced a Sothic calendar any later than that. This latter is as certain a date as we have for any event in antiquity, and Egyptian civilization must have been in full flower at that time. Thus, the idea that Egyptian civilization sprang suddenly onto the stage of world history circa 3100 BCE is simply inadmissible, nor can Sumer be given precedence over Egypt. Thank you for tuning into Hidden Sovereign Truth Revealed. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.